I do have a topic, but it's kind of something that's like, I guess, sort of on the leading edge of like what I've been thinking about with regards to Dharma practice and what some of this stuff means. And I'm sure I'm not the first person to think this, but it's like something that's been relatively fresh for me for the last couple of years. Um, and so we'll just see where it goes. Ram and I are in the DLT at Insight Meditation Center, and we had to write this thing earlier this year called a Dharmology, which is basically like it didn't have to be super long. I think it was 3 or 4 pages or something like that, but it's kind of some expression of, what the Dharma means for us and how we kind of express it, how we believe it to be true, how it works for us. You could argue like, at the present moment, how we might teach it. And so this stuff that I'm going to talk about tonight was part of my Dharmology. Because it's just something that's like I said, kind of at the leading edge of what I'm thinking about here. So yeah, when we get introduced to mindfulness, we get the basic instruction, something along the lines of to be in the present moment, right? And when we're doing like a formal practice, sometimes that includes some invitation to not get lost in thoughts of the past, some invitation to not get lost in thoughts of the future, kind of implying that the present moment occupies some space in between the two. And a little bit of this exploration that I've been doing is kind of asking myself what it means to actually like let go of thoughts of the past. Sure, the invitation to not go down the rabbit hole with regards to memories and things like that is certainly it's a fruitful invitation. It's a fruitful instruction for mindfulness practice. But deep down, I wonder if it's actually possible at all to really let go of the past, even when you're fully in the present. And that's kind of where my thinking has gone with this. And so I want to begin by reading from the Majjhima Nikaya. I'm not going to read the whole sutta, but I will read a section of it. And it's the Mahasatchaka Sutta, which is the longer discourse with Saccaka. And this one talks a little bit about the night of the Buddha's awakening. And the portion I'm going to read is the 3 watches of the night immediately before he found enlightenment. Specifically, the 3 knowledges that the Buddha happened upon, discovered, uncovered, realized before his awakening. And this is him speaking. When my mind was immersed in stillness like this, purified, bright, flawless, rid of corruption, pliable, workable, steady, undisturbable, I extended it toward the recollection of past lives. I recollected my many kinds of past lives, with features and details. This was the first knowledge, which I achieved in the first watch of the night. When my mind was immersed in stillness like this, purified, bright, flawless, rid of corruption, pliable, workable, steady, and indisturbable, I extended it toward knowledge of the death and rebirth of sentient beings. I saw sentient beings passing away and being reborn, inferior and superior, beautiful and ugly, in a good or bad place. I understood how sentient beings are reborn according to their deeds. This was the second knowledge. When my mind was immersed in stillness like this, purified, bright, flawless, rid of corruption, pliable, workable, steady, and indisturbable, I extended it toward knowledge of the ending of defilement. I truly understood this is suffering. This is the origin of suffering. This is the cessation of suffering. This is the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering. I understood rebirth is ended. My spiritual journey has been completed. What had to be done has been done. There is nothing further for this place. And this was the third knowledge. And it was shortly thereafter that the Buddha found awakening. So we have these three knowledges, and I think most of us are pretty familiar with the third one, right? It's the Four Noble Truths. We have all of these lists that we think of as, the Dharma, all the lists that we come to know, whether it's paramis or Eightfold Path, the 37 factors of awakening, the 7 factors of awakening. All of these things kind of stem originally from these Four Noble Truths. And I won't go so far as to say that the first two knowledges that preceded this third knowledge are ignored, but it seems like they don't get a ton of attention. It seems like there's these three progressive knowledges that unfolded for the Buddha that night, and that we spend a lot of time with the third one, but not so much time with the first and the second. This idea of the Buddha coming to understand his past lives, and the idea of him coming to understand the same for all beings, for all sentient beings. So my goal is not to go down the rabbit hole, or let's say my goal is not to get lost in the weeds with regards to rebirth, past lives, future lives, all of that stuff. That's not really what my aim is here. But I think it's important to at least frame the first two knowledges, the first two things that the Buddha came to understand before understanding the Four Noble Truths, related directly to understanding the past. They related directly to understanding karma or karma. They related directly to understanding the way that the past informs the present, whether that was his own life and seeing all like kind of the myriad ways and choices, this lifetime, that lifetime, prior lifetimes, and how all of those things brought him to this present moment right now, or whether he realized the same for other beings. And so then I think I kind of like layer this into this context, this instruction about, coming to the present moment, bringing attention to the present moment. And I think about what we do when it comes to insight practice, whether it's looking at impermanence, whether it's looking at non-self, whether it's looking at suffering. And ultimately what we are doing when we practice Vipassana is looking at the way that karma unfolds, is looking deeply and closely at cause and effect, on what leads to what. And so again, I ask, is it possible to avoid the past entirely, despite being in the present moment? So I'm going to get a little nerdy, but not super nerdy. Because I'm still not entirely sure what the present moment is. I know that somehow the past is kind of reflected in the present moment, but I'm not entirely sure what it is, or at least sometimes I'm sure and sometimes I'm not. And so I'm going to talk about the Big Dipper. I'm going to talk about, the constellation, the Big Dipper. And I won't go so far nerdy that I'll tell you the names of all the stars in the Big Dipper, but I will say there are 7 stars in the Big Dipper. Technically there's 8, but one of them is a binary star it just looks really bright to us, but if you had a telescope you could see that it was 2. But to our eyes it looks like 7. And they're all really far apart from one another. Even though we see them as one constellation, they're all really far apart from each other. So the furthest one is Dubhe, and it's 123 light years away. That means when the Big Dipper's light from that star strikes our eyes, it's been traveling for 123 years. And the nearest star in the Big Dipper is Merak, and it's 78 light years away. So it's been traveling 78 years when it strikes our eyes. So we have 45 years of difference when we see one constellation. And of course, all the other stars fall somewhere in between. And so I consider the fact that like when I'm in this body and I look to the sky and I see the Big Dipper, it may be giving me the impression of simultaneity, that somehow this is happening now, but in reality, what's striking my eye are events that happened with 45 years of separation. What's striking my eye is something that emerged from its star when Teddy Roosevelt was still president, or emerged from the star when the Cold War was starting in 1947. And so maybe the present moment isn't so much about what's happening right now, because even what appears to be happening right now isn't necessarily happening right now. Now we could argue it's the stars, it's the sky, it's really far away. Perhaps, perhaps. But sometimes I like to think of, if you've ever gone to like a baseball game, maybe you sat in left field. And if you've ever gone to a baseball game and heard a batter strike the ball with the bat, you would see that happen, and then a moment later the sound of the bat striking the ball hits your ear. And intellectually we know these happened at the same time. But in our experience they don't. And so I ask again, what's the present moment? And there's this other thought experiment we could do, which is kind of like the reverse of the Big Dipper thought experiment. And I like to call it like the reverse telescope thought experiment. And so imagine a time in your life. It could be recently, it could be 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years ago, whatever comes to mind, in which you were outdoors in the bright sun, enjoying yourself. This could be when you're a child, it could be when you're an adult. And we imagine this sunlight striking the skin and then bouncing off somewhere. That light bounces off the skin, the field. The light bounces off the field you're in, whatever outdoor setting you're in, and it bounces off into space. Somewhere in space right now, someone could turn a telescope to us. Somewhere in space, no matter how long ago this was, someone could see you still walking in that field. Somewhere in space, there's someone who can see every single event that has ever happened in human history right now. Somewhere in space, the Buddha is still walking the earth. And again, it begs the question, like, what is really the present moment? What's happening? And this is kind of like physical, this is science stuff. But to me, it kind of calls into question, at least since our first 5 sense doors are the things that are we kind of consider, we mentally consider to be happening right now. It's kind of interesting to think of the fact that our entire sensory experience is kind of a diorama of different moments in time that all happen to be striking our sense doors at the same time. So maybe the present moment isn't about what's happening so much as about when they strike the sense doors, when they strike eyes, ears, noses, tongues, and then touch our body. So I think the first 5 senses, they're relatively easy to wrap our brain around, right? We hear a sound, we see a sight, we feel a touch, we taste, we smell, we notice it. It may persist for a moment or two, and then it kind of goes away. But the mind is a little bit of a different story, isn't it? The 6th sense door. Sure, everything we're getting through the other senses is kind of filtering through the mind, but the mind does this funny thing where it can experience a sense, remember a sense, store a sense, impression, and then regurgitate it back to us with varying degrees of accuracy, of course. Sometimes accurate, sometimes not so much. Sometimes, more accurate in recent, the recent ones, and then as time goes on, the way that we kind of re-experience sense impressions changes and becomes increasingly less accurate. And so in a way then, we might think of almost everything we experience through the mind door, through the mind, as being experienced through a filter that we might think of as memory. And I'm not talking just about what neuroscientists refer to as declarative memory, which is kind of like the memory of an individual event, like the memory I read that book, I saw that hockey game. I attended the sangha that night. Those are what we think of as declarative memories. There's all these other types of memories that we walk around with that we're not necessarily recalling all the time, but that our experience nonetheless comes through. I hope the words that are coming out of my mouth right now are being understood as having some degree of meaning, and that they're being structured in a grammatical format that has some degree of meaning for you, hopefully, right? And it's doing so because of memory. It's doing so because at some point in the past, we learn these things. And our memories become so habituated and so rote that our experience filters through them. So we have these memories of learning, but we have memories of love. We have memories of trauma. We have memories of being harmed. We have memories of harming people. So many types of memories. You know, if we dig into the science even further, we have epigenetic memories. We have memories that get passed down to us from our parents and grandparents and earlier generations. We have memories in the forms of instincts and drives and selections that came from early humans. We have memories that came from things earlier than humans. If we want to think of memory in this kind of grander scheme of things. And then everything we are experiencing and what we like to think of as the present moment is coming to us through those memories. It's almost as if the past, every moment of the past, every moment of our lives, every moment of human history, every moment of life on earth is in some way collapsed into the present moment for us to experience life through. So in a prior life, not like literally a prior life, but in a lifetime of my own, long enough ago that it feels like a prior life, I was an archaeologist, and I got to dig up dead people. It was a cool job. Didn't pay much money, but it was still fun while it lasted. And we had this term that I think we borrowed from literature, and the term is palimpsest. It's Palimpsest. And rather than just define it, I'm going to offer a little bit of like kind of an imagination exercise. So perhaps picture, again, like a forested area with a creek or a river of some sort. And this would be on a different type of earth than we know today. This would be 10, 15, 20,000 years ago. And you imagine this lush forest with a creek or a river, and early humans come in and they plop down next to this river because it's a good spot. Maybe there's fish in there, there's shade. Who knows, there's food and fruits and berries to gather or what have you, but it's a good place. And so they plop down along this river. They establish a village, and they just do human things. You know, they live and they do human things, and they build human things, and then they drop human things onto the ground. And maybe they live there for a couple of centuries and then move on, and the village disappears. But they left all those things on the ground. And maybe a couple thousand years go by, and that stuff gets covered up with soil. Along comes some more humans. They see the spot. It's a good spot. There's fish. There's a river. There's water. There's resources. So they build a village in the same spot. And they do human things. And then they drop human things in the ground. And they live there for a while. And then the village, for whatever reason, disappears. And then everything they left on the ground gets covered up with soil. Over and over and over and over again for thousands of years, this cycle happens. And then the climate changes. And people don't settle at this river anymore because there is no river. And there is no forest anymore. And eventually it becomes a desert. And in deserts, the wind blows. And when the wind blows, it blows away the soil. Over time, it keeps blowing away the soil. And all of these human things, all of these artifacts that were left behind, they're heavy. So they don't blow away with the soil. They just start collapsing down into one another. And eventually you have tens of thousands of years of human history, thousands of years of different occupations at this site, all collapsed into a single layer, waiting for the archaeologists to discover on the surface of the earth. So right here, in this present moment, this one snapshot contains tens of thousands of years of human history. And of course, it's the archaeologist's job to kind of like tease it all apart, try to figure out who they were, what stories they were, how many different, villages were here, how many centuries or millennia passed, what choices did they make, how were they different and similar from one another. And that's a palimpsest. A palimpsest in archaeology is when tens or thousands of years of different archaeological assemblages get collapsed into one layer. And it waits for us to uncover it. And sometimes I like to think of our practice in the present moment as working with a palimpsest of sorts. That we don't necessarily know when we're practicing where everything that comes up comes from, who it comes from. Some of it's ours, some of it's not. We may never know. Matthew Brensilver, my teacher, sometimes talks about our practice as being a non-specific exposure therapy. So when we sit down on like a cushion, and we've been practicing for a while, we don't have too much agitation and the mind starts to settle, eventually like things just start to bubble forth, whether it's on retreat or in your daily practice. And we don't always understand what they are, but of course our invitation is to let them be and try to push them away and see how it unfolds, right? We don't have a ton of control over what comes up, when it comes up. It doesn't come up in our time or usually according to our wishes for practice. But rest assured, like these things that are coming up are likely the past. They're likely memory. And they might not come up as these declarative memories, right, about an event. They might come up as nervousness, agitation. They might come up as, a dysregulated nervous system. They might show up as the hindrances. You don't really know how the past is going to rear its head during practice, but rest assured that what's coming up is somehow part of the past. In a different lifetime ago of mine, when I was in the county jail, I had been practicing for maybe 6 or 9 months, and I got moved to a new pod at Elmwood, where Ram works. And I got moved to a new pod over there. And I wasn't totally familiar with the rules in this pod. And by rules, I mean the people's rules, not the guards' rules. I'm talking about the prisoner inmate population's rules. And one rule that I wasn't totally keen and clear on was that you could use these tables that we had anytime you wanted throughout the day, except during chow time. During chow time, the tables became the domain of different racial groups. And so when we were getting served meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you were only allowed to sit at your group's table. And then you couldn't pass by or through the seating area of another group's tables until they were done eating. I was a fast eater though. And on one night, I finished my dinner and I decided I was going to beeline for the television, and I passed right through a different group's eating area. And I was surrounded by a bunch of like really angry men. And I won't repeat the types of things they said, but I had some fear, like I would have had my butt handed to me because I was significantly outnumbered if I had to fight these people. And, but I talked my way out of it, which I'm known to do sometimes. But I talked my way out of it, but there was this fear, there was this resentment, and honestly, that particular event planted a little bit of a seed of hatred that I would have to work with and unpack for a number of years after. But I didn't think about this event, this singular event, a whole lot. I didn't think about that event a whole lot. Flash forward 10 years. I'm out of jail, I'm out of prison, and I'm working in construction. And I was on a job site where a bunch of roofers had, they were doing like the hot tar kettle thing where they squirt the hot tar onto the roof. And they had set off a perimeter around it with red tape. And of course, that was to keep me, people like me, from walking underneath the hot tar that was getting squirted onto the roof, right? But I'm walking by this and I see the doorway I need to get to, and it's on the other side of the red tape. And I just said, okay, whatever. I don't see any hot tar dripping down right now. I'm just going to sneak over. And so I went underneath the red tape, and I was swiftly surrounded by lots of angry roofers. And they were trying to keep me safe. So they didn't want to harm me or anything, but they were still hollering and yelling and stuff like that. And I saw red. I felt this surge of rage. I got ready inside to fight back. And this is where, 10 years of what we might think of as the non-specific exposure therapy, 10 years of being comfortable with like letting stuff bubble up without trying to push it away. And what arose for me in that moment, and this is the first moment of this specific kind in my practice, was the memory of that day in the county jail. The memory of the day that those other people in jail had surrounded me and actually threatened me and actually threatened to harm me. And I realized that in this very moment, my anger was directly tied to wanting to do what I couldn't do back then. And the anger went away, and the rage went away. So I didn't change the past, but I recognized in that particular moment the way that the past was compelling me. The way that I was, to a certain extent, trying to relive a moment through what was happening right then. And so in some sense, the past will always be there, but maybe it doesn't have the same power over us once we start to kind of see it for what it is. And that's just one artifact in that big palimpsest. It's just one. And we could argue there's nearly an infinitude of artifacts that we have to deal with in any given moment, but it's just one. So we cannot change this assemblage of the past, but our practice definitely asks us to take a look at it. So I'm going to do something I don't think I've done here before. Maybe I've shared a screen before. I did once share a screen when I was doing the Panyawati talk. Y'all wanted to see a picture of her, but I'm going to share a screen here of a cartoon, or maybe a comic. A cartoon is technically moving, right? So can everybody see that online? You're not going to be able to read it. I'm going to read it all to you. Don't worry. And so I'm not a botanist. I'm not a flower guy. But it is my understanding that many flowers, including orchids, the way that they look is kind of an evolutionary feature that comes from the fact that somehow over time the contours of the orchid come to be because they start to look like the reproductive organs of a pollinating insect. And so a pollinating insect flies because it thinks like that's where I need to go reproduce. And then in the process, they pollinate the flower. So the cartoon, or comic, is called The Bee Orchid. It's by Monroe. And it shows two people walking in a little forested area. And one person is a botanist / flower person, so definitely not me. It says, there are these orchids whose flowers look like female bees when males try to mate with them. They transfer pollen. This orchid, and that's the one that you kind of see painted right there, Ophrys apifera, makes flowers, but no bees land on them, because the bee it mimics went extinct long ago. Without its partner, the orchid has resorted to self-pollinating, a last-ditch genetic strategy that only delays the inevitable. Nothing of the bee remains, but we know it existed from the shape of the flower. It's an idea of what the female bee looked like to the male bee as interpreted by a plant. And the other person with the, I think it's a beret of some sort. Wow. So the only memory of the bee is a painting by a dying flower. And so dude kind of walks back to the orchid, kneels down next to it, and says, "I'll remember your bee, orchid." And I really like this idea. I really like this idea of even the forms we take and the forms that the natural world takes has embedded within it this deep history. This idea that a flower we could be walking by is the way it is because many millennia ago, or tens of millennia ago, or hundreds of thousands of years ago, there was a bee that kept it alive. And it's carrying on the image of that bee in some kind of like artistic, interpretive fashion in its very body. You know, I don't know how to pin her down. So there's a woman named Donna Haraway. And I want to just, it'd be easy if she was just like Buddhist teacher or something, but she's not. So she's a feminist professor of biology, consciousness, and culture. And I'll leave it at that. She does a lot of things. But she had a comment about this comic, and she said, "The cartoon does something special. It does not mistake lures for identities. It does not say the flower is exactly like the extinct insect's genitals. Instead, the flower collects the bee aslant. In desire and immortality, no longer embraced by living buzzing bees, the flower is a speaker for the dead." I like this idea, and I'd like to expand upon it. Because if we think about this flower as a speaker for the dead, I don't necessarily think that the flower is particularly unique in this respect. One could argue that everything, every living being that currently exists in some capacity is a speaker for the dead. We are speakers for the dead. The present moment is speaking for the dead. So our bodies, like literally the way we look, it's products of millions, if not billions of years of choices that followed from preferences, from desire, from fear of death. We wouldn't look the way we do or think the way we do if people in our past hadn't found particular things more attractive or less attractive, for better or for worse. And so I asked myself, and this is where the exploration really is for me, is like, how might the two knowledges that preceded the Buddha's third knowledge, how might those two knowledge about his own past lives and the past lives of other beings be understood as some sort of like perfected understanding of this notion that everything in the present moment speaks for the dead? What would it be like to understand that perfectly? So as we live our lives, we carve out what remains of that infinitude of ancestral choices. We might be able, with mindfulness, to re-envision what came before, and then we get to keep what we like, or try to. And then we get to discard what we don't like, or try to. And like the flower, what might it be like to actually think of what we're doing with practice and what we're doing with just being present with this palimpsest of the past is a kind of a work of art, right? Is what we do with our lives with mindfulness becomes an interpretation of the past, or a reinterpretation of the past. A way of no longer letting it compel us, but allowing us to instead rearrange it for the benefit of ourselves and all beings. In a sense, then, like this is the creativity that we might be able to discover or uncover in this archaeology of the present moment. And what really is creativity if it's not freedom? And it's not freedom from a different past, but I suppose freedom to choose what we do with that past going forward. Yeah. So I offer this for your consideration.